The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with the Ridgemont Valley HOA seal and signed by President Linda Hutcherson herself. Marcus Webb, 52, a petroleum geologist who'd spent 3 decades mapping underground reserves across Wyoming, read the demand letter 3 times before his coffee went cold. Immediate removal of unauthorized structures, compliance within 14 days, daily fines of $500 commenced thereafter. Marcus looked out his kitchen window at the workshop he'd built 6 months ago, the one that sat 200 yards from any HOA boundary line, on land his grandfather had purchased in 1947. He'd ignored the first 2 letters, assuming reason would prevail. The HOA had been filing complaints for 8 months now, ever since new board members took control and decided his 20-acre valley property didn't fit their vision of uniform suburban perfection. But this morning's ultimatum changed everything. Because what Linda Hutcherson and her board didn't know was that Marcus Webb wasn't just any property owner, and the land they were claiming jurisdiction over held secrets that would flip their entire power structure completely upside down. Before we see how a geologist turned decades of HOA overreach into their worst financial nightmare, if you love stories where entitled boards finally meet someone who actually read the fine print, smash that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a patient man past his breaking point, the confrontation where underground secrets became surface-level leverage, and the resolution where an entire HOA learned that some property owners know exactly what they own, including what's beneath the surface. Picture 8 months of escalating harassment from an HOA board drunk on manufactured authority, fines for a workshop that wasn't in their jurisdiction, demands to remove native landscaping, threats of liens against property that predated their subdivision by 40 years. Marcus had tried patience, tried reason, tried showing them the actual boundary surveys. Every attempt met with dismissal, condescension, and more certified letters. The turning point came when they threatened legal action, when Linda Hutcherson made the catastrophic mistake of claiming the HOA had authority over his entire valley property. That's when Marcus stopped defending and started researching. That's when the geologist did what geologists do best. He went digging into what lay beneath the surface, both literally and legally. The confrontation didn't happen at an HOA meeting or through lawyers. It happened in Marcus's driveway on a Saturday morning when Linda Hutcherson arrived with 2 board members and a contractor, ready to enforce their demands personally. What they encountered instead was a man holding a leather portfolio containing documents they'd never imagined existed. Mineral rights surveys from 1947, subsurface easement maps that showed exactly what ran underneath their precious streets, access agreements their developer had signed and forgotten. Marcus didn't raise his voice once. He simply laid out the documents one by one and watched their faces change from entitled confidence to dawning horror as they realized the man they'd been threatening for 8 months owned something far more valuable than surface land. He owned what was underneath their entire development. The resolution played out over 6 weeks and transformed an entire subdivision's financial reality. Because when you learn that someone owns the mineral and subsurface rights beneath your streets, your water lines, your electrical conduits, and you've spent 8 months harassing that person, the leverage shifts in ways that can't be undone. Marcus didn't seek revenge. He simply exercised rights that had existed for 77 years, rights the HOA had assumed didn't matter, rights that came with very specific terms about access, usage, and compensation. The board that had threatened him with fines discovered what real financial obligation looked like. And the geologist, who just wanted to be left alone in his valley, finally got the peace he'd been asking for all along with a revenue stream that made their $500 daily fines look like pocket change. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Webb had returned to Wyoming 3 years ago after 31 years of mapping oil and gas reserves across the western United States. His career had taken him from the Permian Basin to the Bakken Formation, from courtrooms as an expert witness to drilling sites as a consultant. When his wife Rachel died from cancer in 2021, Marcus made the decision to return to the land his grandfather Webb had purchased in 1947, back when Ridgemont Valley was nothing but cattle range and sagebrush. The 20-acre property sat in a natural valley depression, surrounded by red rock formations and expansive Wyoming sky. Marcus built a modest ranch house in 2022, then added a workshop 6 months later for his geology equipment, rock samples, and surveying tools. He'd earned his peace. He'd earned his solitude. What he hadn't anticipated was that the sprawling Ridgemont Estates subdivision that had grown up around his property over the past 15 years would suddenly decide his grandfather's land belonged under their authority. The first letter arrived in March of 2024. Notification of architectural violation, unapproved structure. Marcus had actually laughed, because his workshop sat on land that predated the HOA by 4 decades. He'd called the board, left a polite voicemail explaining the boundary error, and assumed that would be the end of it. The second letter came 3 weeks later, this time from Linda Hutcherson, the newly elected HOA president. A real estate agent who'd moved to Wyoming from California 2 years ago, Linda had campaigned on maintaining property values through strict compliance and unified aesthetic standards. Her letter informed Marcus that regardless of when his property was acquired, it fell within the expanded community interest zone and would be subject to HOA guidelines. Marcus drove to the HOA office with his property survey, his title documentation, and his grandfather's original deed. Linda looked at the documents for approximately 45 seconds before sliding them back across her desk. "These are very old papers, Mr. Webb," she'd said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Our attorney will clarify the actual boundaries. In the meantime, I suggest you comply with our reasonable requests." Reasonable requests. That phrase echoed in Marcus's mind over the following months as the requests escalated into demands. April brought a citation for his non-conforming native landscaping, which was actually just natural Wyoming vegetation that had grown there for centuries. May delivered a formal complaint about his industrial-style workshop, which was a simple pole barn painted to match the surrounding terrain. June arrived with a demand to remove his grandfather's original tool shed, a structure built in 1952 that Linda claimed was an eyesore visible from the subdivision. Each letter came with increasingly aggressive language. Each phone call to the board met with dismissal or outright hostility. Marcus tried attending an HOA meeting in July, bringing his surveyor to present the actual property boundaries. Linda had gavelled him silent after 90 seconds, stating that, "This board doesn't recognize surveys that contradict our community's established interest zones." The breaking point came on a scorching August morning when Marcus returned from a weekend consulting job in Montana. Someone had spray-painted orange X marks across his workshop doors and windows, HOA violation notices zip-tied to every handle. But worse, far worse, was the letter taped to his front door. Final notice. Compliance deadline September 1st. Failure to remove unauthorized structures will result in legal action including property liens, daily fines of $500, and potential forced sale to recover HOA damages. Your property exists within our community boundaries, and you will comply with community standards. The letter was signed by Linda Hutcherson and countersigned by the entire board. Marcus stood in his driveway holding that letter, looking at the orange X marks defacing his property, and felt something shift inside him. He'd spent 8 months being patient. He'd tried reason, tried documentation, tried appealing to common sense. They'd responded with escalation, vandalism, and threats to take land his family had owned since before any of them were born. Marcus Webb had built a career on understanding what existed beneath the surface. He'd testified in mineral rights disputes across 6 states. He'd consulted on subsurface easement cases that had reshaped property law. And as he stood there in the Wyoming heat, looking at that threat letter, a memory surfaced from his grandfather's stories. Stories about the rights his grandfather had negotiated when he bought this land. Rights that had seemed insignificant in 1947, when the valley was empty rangeland. Rights that Marcus had inherited but never needed to exercise. Until now. Marcus walked into his house, pulled his grandfather's original deed documentation from the fireproof safe, and spread the papers across his dining room table. Then he opened his laptop and began researching exactly what had been built on the land surrounding his property since 1975. What he found made him smile for the first time in months, because Linda Hutcherson and her board had just threatened the one person in Ridgemont Valley who knew exactly what lay beneath their streets, their homes, and their precious community interest zones. And what lay beneath changed everything. The confrontation arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, September 7th, exactly 1 week after the HOA's compliance deadline had passed. Marcus was in his workshop cataloging mineral samples when he heard vehicles in his driveway. 3 cars. Linda Hutcherson's white Lexus SUV, board member David Chen's Tesla, and a contractor's pickup truck loaded with demolition equipment. Marcus watched through the window as Linda emerged, clipboard in hand, wearing her realtor blazer-like armor. 2 other board members flanked her. The contractor, a weathered man in his 50s, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Marcus walked out to meet them, carrying a leather portfolio that had accompanied him to depositions across the western United States. His expression was calm. His pulse was steady. He'd spent the past 2 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. "Mr. Webb," Linda announced, her voice projecting across the driveway as if addressing a crowd. "You've ignored our final compliance deadline. We're here to oversee the removal of your unauthorized structures. We've brought a contractor to handle the demolition. You can cooperate, or we can proceed with legal action while the work continues." David Chen stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding at each pronouncement. The third board member, a woman named Patricia Morrison, held a camera, apparently documenting the confrontation for their records. Marcus looked at the contractor, who met his eyes and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Smart man." Marcus opened the portfolio. "Before you proceed," he said quietly, "I need to show you something. It's going to change your understanding of this situation significantly." Linda's expression didn't shift. "We're not interested in more of your old surveys, Mr. Webb. Our attorney has reviewed the boundaries. Your property falls under HOA jurisdiction. That's final." Marcus pulled out the first document, a survey map from 1947 marked with official county stamps and geological notations. "This is my grandfather's original deed," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used in courtrooms when explaining complex geological concepts to juries. "When Lawrence Webb purchased this property in 1947, he negotiated something that was common in Wyoming at the time, but rarely understood by modern homeowners. He didn't just buy surface rights to 20 acres. He retained complete mineral and subsurface rights to approximately 200 acres, including most of what's now your subdivision. The contractor took a step backward. Linda's expression flickered with uncertainty before hardening again. "That's absurd," she said. "Mineral rights don't give you authority over our property." Marcus pulled out the second document, a detailed subsurface easement map marked with legal descriptions and county recordings from 1978. "You're partially correct," he said. "Mineral rights alone wouldn't matter much if nothing was being extracted. But when this subdivision was developed in 1975 through 1992, the developer needed to run infrastructure through the subsurface areas my grandfather controlled. Water lines, sewer systems, electrical conduits, gas lines. All of it runs through subsurface zones covered by the Webb family mineral and easement rights." He laid out a third document, a copy of the original development agreement. "Your developer, Ridgemont Properties, LLC, signed an access and usage agreement with my grandfather in 1978. The terms were simple. They could run infrastructure through the subsurface areas he controlled in exchange for annual easement fees and permanent acknowledgement that surface development near his property would never be subject to HOA authority. Your HOA inherited those obligations when you incorporated in 1995. David Chen grabbed the document from Marcus's hand, scanning it quickly. His face went pale. "These fees," he said slowly, "it says $1,000 per year adjusted for inflation annually." Marcus nodded. "Approximately $3,200 currently. Your HOA hasn't paid easement fees since 2018. That's 6 years of unpaid obligations, plus accumulated interest at the rate specified in the agreement, roughly $24,000. The silence stretched across the driveway. Patricia's camera hand had lowered. Linda was staring at the documents spread across the hood of Marcus's truck. "But that's not the important part," Marcus continued, his voice still quiet, still calm. "The important part is Clause 17 of the Subsurface Access Agreement. The part that addresses what happens if the surface development entity, that's your HOA, attempts to claim authority over the original property owner's land in violation of the perpetual boundary acknowledgement." Marcus pulled out the final document, this one marked with highlighted sections and legal tabs. Clause 17 states that any attempt by the development entity to impose fees, liens, or structural demands on the original property constitutes a material breach of the easement agreement. In the event of material breach, the property owner has the right to renegotiate all terms, including annual fees, or revoke subsurface access entirely. He let that sink in for a moment, watching realization dawn on Linda's face. "You understand what that means, correct? Every water line serving your subdivision runs through easement zones I control. Your sewer system, your electrical grid, your natural gas supply. If I revoke access, your infrastructure becomes non-compliant. Your homes become unsellable. Your property values, which you've spent 8 months lecturing me about, would crater within a week." The contractor had retreated to his truck. Patricia Morrison looked like she might be sick. David Chen was rereading the documents with shaking hands. Linda Hutcherson, to her credit, tried to maintain composure. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No one would actually cut off infrastructure to an entire subdivision." Marcus closed the portfolio. "You're right, I wouldn't, because unlike your board, I'm not interested in causing harm to innocent people. But I am going to exercise my rights under the agreement. Starting today, easement fees return to current status, with back payments due within 90 days. Additionally, because your board has spent 8 months attempting to impose authority over my property in direct violation of the boundary acknowledgement, I'm invoking the renegotiation clause." Annual easement fees will increase to fair market value for subsurface access rights in a developed area, which my attorney calculates at approximately $18,000 annually, adjusted for inflation going forward. Linda found her voice. That's extortion. Marcus's expression didn't change. That's contract law. You signed the agreement when your HOA incorporated. You inherited all obligations. You want to talk about property values and community standards. Let's talk about what happens when word gets out that your HOA board threatened legal action against the property owner who controls your infrastructure access. Let's discuss how that affects resale values in your precious subdivision. He pointed to the spray-painted X marks still visible on his workshop. You vandalized my property. You sent me threat letters for 8 months. You showed up today with a demolition contractor. I have every legal right to revoke access entirely and let your attorneys sort out the consequences. Instead, I'm offering you a simple solution. Pay what you owe, acknowledge my property boundaries, and leave me alone. Forever. The board members stood frozen in Marcus's driveway, the demolition equipment sitting unused in the contractor's truck. Finally, David Chen spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to call an emergency board meeting. Linda's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. She stared at Marcus for a long moment, and he could see her running calculations, weighing options, realizing there were none. This isn't over, she said, but it sounded hollow. Marcus picked up his portfolio. Actually, Mrs. Hutcherson, it is. You attempted to claim authority over land you never had rights to. You threatened a property owner who holds leverage you didn't know existed. The only question now is whether you pay what you owe quietly, or whether this becomes a legal battle that exposes your board's incompetence to your entire community. Your choice. You have 72 hours to provide written acknowledgement of my property boundaries and a payment plan for the outstanding easement fees. After that, my attorney files for contract enforcement and fee renegotiation. I suggest you choose wisely. He turned and walked back toward his workshop, leaving the board members standing in silence beside their expensive vehicles and their useless demolition equipment. The emergency HOA board meeting happened that Sunday evening, 16 hours after Linda Hutcherson's failed attempt at property enforcement. Marcus didn't attend. He didn't need to. He spent the evening on his back porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset paint the red rocks amber and gold, while his attorney received increasingly frantic calls from the HOA's legal counsel. By Monday morning, a courier delivered a formal letter to Marcus's property. The HOA acknowledged his boundary rights, withdrew all violation notices, and proposed a payment plan for the outstanding easement fees. The letter was professional, almost warm, signed by David Chen. Linda Hutcherson's signature was notably absent. Marcus learned later that week that Linda had resigned from the board Sunday night, citing time constraints and professional obligations. Her replacement, a retired civil engineer named Robert Mills, called Marcus personally to apologize for the 8 months of harassment and to discuss the easement agreement in detail. Robert actually understood subsurface rights. Robert had actually read the development documents before taking his board position. Robert, Marcus decided, was someone he could work with. The payment plan was straightforward: $24,000 in outstanding fees, paid in quarterly installments over 12 months, plus the renegotiated annual fee of $18,000 beginning the following January. The HOA's attorney had tried to negotiate the annual fee down to $12,000. Marcus's attorney had countered with $22,000 and documentation showing comparable subsurface easement rates in developed areas across Wyoming. They settled at $18,000, with a provision that the fee would be reviewed every 5 years based on market rates and subdivision growth. The HOA also agreed to fund a professional survey to clearly mark the boundaries between Marcus's property and the subdivision's community interest zones, ending any future disputes about jurisdiction. Marcus insisted on one additional term: a perpetual easement acknowledgement be recorded with the county and included in every property sale disclosure within the subdivision. Future homeowners would know exactly who controlled the ground beneath their feet. But Linda Hutcherson wasn't finished. 6 weeks after her resignation, she tried one final play. She'd contacted 3 board members from the neighboring Creekside HOA, which bordered the opposite side of Marcus's property, and convinced them to file their own infrastructure claim. The legal letter arrived in late October, asserting that Creekside HOA also had structures near his property line and demanding he acknowledge their authority over shared boundary zones. Marcus read the letter, made one phone call to his attorney, and had a response delivered within 48 hours. The response included detailed maps showing that Creekside's infrastructure ran through a completely different easement corridor, one that didn't involve Webb family subsurface rights at all. However, the response noted, Linda Hutcherson's attempt to instigate a secondary dispute constituted tortious interference with Marcus's existing easement agreements. Marcus's attorney politely suggested that unless Linda wanted to become personally liable for damages, she should cease all contact regarding his property. The Creekside Board received copies of the Ridgemont easement agreement and withdrew their claim within a week. Linda Hutcherson quietly relocated to Arizona 3 months later. The financial impact on the Ridgemont Estates HOA was significant but manageable. The back fees and new annual obligations required a special assessment of approximately $140 per household annually, spread across the subdivision's 217 homes. At the December HOA meeting, Robert Mills presented the situation to the community with complete transparency. He explained the history of the easement agreement, acknowledged the previous board's failures, and outlined why the fees were legally obligated and non-negotiable. Several homeowners expressed frustration, but most directed their anger at Linda Hutcherson and the board members who'd spent 8 months harassing a property owner without understanding the legal landscape they were operating in. One homeowner, a retired attorney named Margaret Singh, stood during the open comment period and said something Marcus heard about later. The previous board spent 8 months trying to bully a man off property his family has owned for 77 years. They vandalized his buildings. They threatened liens. They showed up with demolition equipment. Paying $18,000 a year for the infrastructure that makes our homes livable is not punishment. It's what we should have been paying all along. This is embarrassing, but it's fair. 2 months later, in January of 2025, Marcus received the first renegotiated easement payment, $18,000 paid in full ahead of schedule. Robert Mills included a handwritten note. Mr. Webb, thank you for your patience with our transition. The previous board created this situation through ignorance and overreach. You resolved it with professionalism and restraint. Our community owes you an apology and our respect. If you ever need anything from this HOA, you have my personal commitment that we'll handle it properly. Marcus filed the check, framed the note, and hung it in his workshop beside his grandfather's original deed. The spray-painted X marks had been removed, replaced with nothing but the workshop's original color. The orange violation notices had been collected and burned in his fire pit one cold November night. The land looked exactly as it should, peaceful, undisturbed, his. Marcus stood in his valley on a February morning, coffee steaming in the cold air, looking at the red rock formations that had watched over this land for millions of years. The subdivision surrounding his property hummed with quiet morning activity. people heading to work, kids waiting for school buses, dogs being walked on HOA-approved sidewalks. All of it possible because water flowed through pipes beneath their streets, because electricity ran through conduits underground, because infrastructure existed in spaces his grandfather had secured rights to 77 years ago. Marcus hadn't wanted conflict. He'd wanted peace, solitude, the space to process his grief and build a quiet life in the place his family had always belonged. The HOA had decided he didn't have the right to that peace. They'd tried to impose their authority through threat letters and intimidation. And in doing so, they'd learned a lesson that applied far beyond property boundaries. Never assume you understand someone's leverage. Never assume that patience equals weakness. And never, ever threaten someone who spent 31 years as an expert in understanding exactly what lies beneath the surface. Marcus Webb had won not through revenge, but through knowledge. He'd won because he'd done his homework while others had relied on assumption and borrowed authority. He'd won because his grandfather had been smart enough to secure rights that seemed insignificant in 1947, but proved invaluable in 2024. And as Marcus stood there in his valley, watching the sunrise paint the rocks in shades of amber and crimson, he felt something he hadn't felt in 8 long months, complete and total peace. The HOA had their subdivision. He had his land, his workshop, his solitude, and an $18,000 a year reminder that respect isn't demanded. It's earned through understanding what you actually own and having the patience to prove it when challenged. Across the country in Portland, Maine, Sarah Chen, a 47-year-old maritime attorney, stared at the parking boot clamped to her Tesla's front wheel. The note attached read, "Unauthorized parking in resident-only space. $500 fine for removal." The problem, Sarah owned the parking space. She'd purchased it separately in 1998 with a separate deed, separate property taxes, and a boundary survey. Her condo association's new property manager apparently hadn't bothered to check the records before deciding to monetize what he assumed was common area. Sarah pulled out her phone, photographed the boot, then dialed her office. "Jennifer, pull the Harbor View Condo Association bylaws and my parking space deed. Also call our real estate litigation team. Someone just made a very expensive assumption about property ownership." The property manager, watching from his office window, smiled until he saw Sarah's smile back. A maritime attorney who specialized in property disputes, a separately deeded parking space, a boot that constituted conversion of private property. But that's a story for another time.